Richard Choque Flores was the kind of predator who left survivors too traumatized, too ashamed and frightened to speak out. By the time police finally understood the scale of what he had done, more than 77 women were believed to have been pulled into his trap. Years before the full truth came out, Richard had already been caught. A court had seen enough to send him away for 30 years. And for the people he had already destroyed, that sentence was the only comfort left. Richard was supposed to be gone. On the 17th of May 2021, in El Alto, Bolivia, a 17-year-old female named Lucy Mayer left home and told her family she would be back in a few hours. But she never came back. By the next morning, the family's worst fear became real. A call came through from someone disguising their voice, telling them they had one day to find $70,000. If they didn't, Lucy would be killed. They were warned not to go to the police, and then the line went dead. But the threat didn't stop there. Photos were pushed through the family's door, showing Lucy still alive, bound by her hands and feet. And then came something even worse. Images of mutilated bodies, his previous victims, sent as a warning of what would happen if they didn't do as he asked. What no one knew then was that Lucy's disappearance was only the beginning, because when police finally uncovered the truth, they would expose not only one of Bolivia's most disturbing murderers, but also the people who helped put him back on the streets. Richard Choque Flores was born on the 9th of November 1988 in El Alto, Bolivia, a city just outside of La Paz. His father was a police officer, his mother was a teacher, and he grew up with his sister. But when Richard was still young, his father was killed whilst on duty. Some reports say he was shot during a shootout, and after his death, Richard's grandmother pushed for compensation. The family were later given a property in the San Martin area of El Alto. But whatever that house was supposed to give them, it didn't seem to bring much peace. After his father died, Richard's mother became more closed off. Neighbours later described her as distant, someone who barely spoke, even when they tried with her. And Richard seemed to grow up in that same kind of isolation. He was quiet, withdrawn, hard to get to know. Even in school, when teachers tried to get him involved, he felt more comfortable pulling himself away. Years later, after Richard's grandmother died, the family inherited another property, this time a much larger house in the Bolivian area. At the time, these were just family homes in El Alto, but years later, both houses the family owned would become some of the most disturbing places in Bolivia, because buried within them were secrets Richard had managed to hide for years. By his teenage years, Richard's behaviour had reportedly started to darken. Some accounts claim he became obsessed with adult material and began searching for more extreme content. At the same time, he also seemed drawn to authority. Like his father, he was pulled towards uniform and discipline, and at 17, he entered military school, but he didn't last long, and he left shortly afterwards, and the reason has never been properly explained. What is clear is that Richard never became the man he seemed to want people to think he was. That failed attempt would matter later, because Richard would eventually use it to make himself sound like he knew how military training worked. But for now, that part of the story stayed hidden inside the family. One of the few relatives Richard had spent time with growing up was his younger cousin on his father's side, Fidel Lision Shoku. Fidel would visit on weekends, and the two appeared to get along. At the time, there was nothing about that relationship that seemed especially important. But years later, Fidel's name would become one of the most painful parts of this entire case. But Fidel was not the reason Richard's name first became known. That would happen 2 years later through a young law student named Blanca Ruby Limici. By 2013, Blanca had been studying law at the public University of El Alto for around 2 years. She came from a poor family, but she was trying to push herself forward. She kept her grades up, helped around the house, and looked after her 3 younger siblings. In her mind, law was not just a degree, it was a way to one day help people like her own family, people who needed someone to fight for them. But while Blanca had ambition, she did not have much money. She had no real income of her own, and as time went on, that started to weigh on her. She wanted to keep studying, but she also wanted to help at home and build something better for herself. And that was the part Richard seemed to understand. He did not just offer money, he offered her a way to keep chasing the future she already wanted. Through Facebook, Blanca had been contacted by a man calling himself Mauricio Turan. The profile was fake, but it was made to look convincing enough. He claimed he was connected to the military academy and told Blanca he could help her get in. If she accepted, she could continue her studies and earn money at the same time. To someone already worried about money, that kind of offer would have been difficult to ignore. On the 20th of November 2013, Blanca left home and made her way to university. But she never made it there when her mother, Nancy, realized something was wrong. She tried calling her daughter, but got no answer. Then came a message sent from Blanca's own phone. The person writing it had said Blanca had been kidnapped, and if Nancy wanted her daughter back alive, she needed to pay $20,000. She was warned not to get the police involved. But Nancy was not in a position where she could simply find that kind of money. And even if she had tried, there was no guarantee her daughter would be released. She made the decision to contact the authorities, but even then, she was terrified the kidnapper might be watching or listening. According to reports, she used another phone because she feared her own phone had been tapped. From there, she contacted the Special Crime Fighting Force and told them what had happened. Police immediately began working with her. They looked into Blanca's final communications and found the fake Facebook profile that had contacted her. Mauricio Terrin was not some helpful military contact. He was a mask, and they felt that this was the person who had abducted her. For days, Nancy kept the communication going, while investigators planned how to catch him. She was told to make the kidnapper believe the money had been gathered, and that it would be left in a public place for him to collect. Richard went there thinking he was dealing with a frightened mother who had no choice but to obey him. But this time, he had misjudged her. The police were waiting. When officers arrested him, the fake story collapsed. The man who had promised Blanca a chance to study and earn money was revealed as Richard Shoku Flores, then just 25 years old. But the arrest did not bring Blanca home alive. When police searched his property in San Martin, they found her body buried at the back of the house, inside a blue jute bag. Blanca had been spiked with diazepam after being persuaded to drink when she arrived at the house. Within minutes, she would have been unable to defend herself. What followed was not just an attack, but a level of violence that even investigators later struggled to speak about openly. Forensic evidence showed she had suffered blunt force trauma to the head, signs of strangulation, and multiple stab wounds all across her body. This was before she was killed. In the end, Blanca died from asphyxiation. Richard had simply covered her nose and mouth. And as officers searched further, the case began to look even darker. Investigators found women's clothing, underwear, and identification documents belonging to other young women. Blanca did not look like an isolated attack. She looked like this was the first part of something much bigger. Just how many other women had already fallen victim to Richard? Richard was eventually convicted for the kidnapping, abuse, and murder of Blanca. In 2015, he was sentenced to Bolivia's maximum punishment, 30 years in prison without the right to parole. That should have been the end of him. But for one woman, watching Richard's face appear on the news, the arrest didn't bring relief. It made her think back to her own son. That woman was Richard's own aunt, Fidel's mother. For 2 years, she had been trying to get a straight answer about where Fidel was. And now the nephew who had taken him away was being accused of luring, killing, and burying a young woman. Because before Blanca's name was ever linked to Richard, Fidel had already vanished. And to understand what happened, you have to go back to 2011. Fidel had known Richard since childhood. He was the younger cousin on his father's side, the one who would come over at weekends. And from what the family could see, the two of them got on well enough. So when Fidel finished school and said that he wanted to join military school, Richard saw that as an opportunity. He had been to military school himself, even if it hadn't lasted long, and he used that to make himself sound far more capable than he really was. To Fidel's mother, he made it seem like he understood the process and could help get her son through it. Richard made himself sound like the one person who could get Fidel through the door. He said he could train him, prepare him, and sort out what was needed. And because he was older, confident, and family, Fidel's mother trusted him. She gave Richard around $5,000, believing it would cover everything, including fees, paperwork, and training. To her, this money was going towards her son's future, but to Richard, it was just another part of the trap. On the 19th of May 2011, Fidel left with Richard. His mother thought her son was heading towards a life he had chosen for himself. At first, there was still some contact, just enough to make the arrangement feel real. But then Fidel became harder to reach. And before long, Richard was the only one explaining why. Whenever she tried to speak to her son, Richard had a reason ready. Fidel was busy, he was training, he couldn't be disturbed. At first, that might have sounded believable, because military life was supposed to be strict. But then the story started moving. Richard claimed Fidel was doing well, then said there were more costs. At one point, Fidel was supposedly away on a parachuting course in Haiti. Other times, Richard said he was in Cochabamba or Santa Cruz. The place kept changing, but the answer was always the same. Fidel was fine, he was just busy. And while his mother was clinging to those excuses, Richard kept asking for more. More money for studies, for equipment, more money for things Fidel supposedly needed. Every new story came with a new reason to pay. He wasn't just keeping Fidel out of reach, he was turning his mother's hope into money. As time passed, the stories became harder to accept. Fidel never came home, and he never contacted his mother in a way that proved he was safe. There was never a clear address or anyone outside Richard who could confirm what was happening. Everything came through him, and every answer seemed to involve Fidel moving further away. Then, in 2013, Richard was arrested for Blanca's murder, and for Fidel's mother, that changed everything. So she went to the prison and confronted him. She asked him where her son was. She asked for anything that could prove Fidel was still alive. But Richard gave her nothing. Every answer led nowhere, and every explanation came without proof. He never gave her the one thing she needed, a way to hear her son's voice for herself. And that was what made it so unbearable. Richard was sitting there in prison, already exposed as a killer, and still he kept control of Fidel's story. He knew his aunt had no way to force the truth out of him, so instead of giving her peace, He kept her stuck in the same place she had been for years, hoping her son was still alive. So she began checking the stories herself. She followed the places Richard had mentioned, hoping that somewhere, someone would have been able to confirm Fidel had been there. But every lead collapsed. There was no sign of training, no record that matched what Richard had claimed, and nothing proved the life he had been describing had ever existed. The future she had been paying for was starting to look like another one of his lies. In 2016, after years of being given stories that led nowhere, Fidel's mother finally reported Richard to the police over her son's disappearance. And that was when Richard's own family turned nasty. Fidel's mother and sister began receiving threatening phone calls from people who seemed to know exactly where they were and what they were doing. At times, the callers even described the clothes they were wearing in that moment, as if someone was standing nearby watching them. They told them they knew where they lived and warned them that if they kept going, something would happen to them. Then not long after, Fidel's mother and sister were involved in a road accident, and whether that was connected or not, it frightened them enough to make them stop. They backed away from the complaint and left the home they had been living in, because by then, asking questions didn't feel pointless. It felt dangerous. Even after that, Richard's family still found ways to keep her away from the truth. His mother and sister were said to have blocked Fidel's mother from visiting him in prison, cutting her off from the only person who may have been forced to say where Fidel was. By then, she had been lied to, threatened, frightened out of her own home, and pushed into silence by the people protecting him. And while Fidel's disappearance stayed unanswered, the rest of Bolivia believed Richard was exactly where he belonged, behind bars serving a 30-year sentence, unable to hurt anyone else. For most people, that should have been where the case ends. Richard had been exposed, convicted, and taken off the streets. Whatever questions still surrounded him, at least he could do no more harm. But 6 years later, in the same city of El Alto, females started disappearing again, horrifying the local community. By May 2021, Lucy Mayer had already disappeared, the same case we opened with. Her family had been sent the ransom demand, the photos, and then nothing. 3 months later, it happened again, this time to 15-year-old Iris Malin. She had gone out in the morning, reportedly to arrange christening invitations for her younger brother, but she also never returned. Her family were sent photos of her tied to a bed, showing she was alive, and again there were ransom demands. But Lucy and Iris were not the only names reaching police. Around the same time, women were reporting that they had been lured through social media by someone offering them money or work. The details changed, but the trap was always built in the same way. It usually started with a fake profile and an offer that sounded believable, enough to get them to a meeting place. Once they arrived, Richard would turn the whole thing on them. Some women were threatened with substances that he had planted on them. Others were made to believe that they were about to be arrested and that their only way out was to do exactly what he said. In some cases, he forced them to record videos admitting to crimes they hadn't committed, giving him something to use against them later. That was how he kept them trapped. He used the fear of prison, the shame of being exposed, and the threat that no one would believe them. Some were extorted for money, others were intimately abused. And even when he didn't kill, he still left women terrified, controlled, and too frightened to speak out. Then, in January 2022, one woman managed to get out of the trap before it closed properly. Richard had contacted her through social media, using a fake female profile and offering paid work. He told her she would be carrying packages, but when they met, he tried to steer her towards a flat, but she refused and took him somewhere else instead. Once inside, Richard pulled out his police uniform and a badge and accused her of carrying substances. And then he started searching through her belongings. But before he could take things further, another person walked in. Richard was panicked and fled. That woman went to the police, and when officers followed the complaint, they finally found the man behind the fake profiles. Only then did they realize who they had actually caught. It was Richard Choque Flores, the same man who had been sentenced to 30 years for Blanca's murder. The same man Bolivia believed had been locked away for good. And yet here he was, years later, back on the streets using fake profiles again, targeting vulnerable women, and now connected to the disappearances of 2 teenage girls. That was when the real question became, how was Richard free? The answer was almost worse because it was so simple. Back in 2019, Richard was still meant to be serving the 30-year sentence he had been given for Blanca's murder. That sentence should have kept him inside until 2045, so there should have been no way back to El Alto. But while Blanca's family believed he was locked away, Richard and the people around him were already working on a way to get him out. The excuse being used was his health. His lawyers claimed Richard was seriously ill and that prison was putting his life at risk. But for that to work, they needed proof. So they got in touch with a doctor who they bribed to create a false medical certificate, claiming Richard suffered from a long list of conditions, including diabetes and other illnesses that supposedly required special treatment outside prison. On paper, he was made to look like a sick man who needed help. In reality, the illness was part of the escape route. Richard would later reportedly admit he had not even been properly examined, and that the medical problems used to justify his release were false. And then came the judge. Rafael Alcon was accused of accepting money to approve Richard's release, with reports claiming the bribe was around $3,500 and a bottle of whiskey. That was all it took for a convicted killer, a man sentenced to 30 years without parole, to be moved out of prison and back onto the streets. So on Christmas Eve 2019, while families across Bolivia were getting ready for the holidays, Richard Choque was given house arrest. He had not served his sentence and nothing suggested he was safe to be on the outside. But somehow, the same system that was meant to keep him locked away had let him free. From there, Richard returned to El Alto and went back to live with his mother. And suddenly, everything police had been looking at made sense. The fake profiles, the women reporting abuse, the planting of substances, the disappearances of Lucy and Iris. All of it led back to a man who was supposed to be still in prison. When police arrested Richard, they recovered phones, substances, and a firearm. And once investigators began to go through those phones, the wider picture started to come together. Messages, fake accounts, and conversations with women, all of it pointed back to the same trap. But one of the most disturbing parts was that Richard may have not been operating completely alone. Prosecutors later said that the fake Facebook profiles used to lure victims were also operated by his mother and sister. Allegedly, they had been posting the job adverts and replying to the applicants. That did not mean every detail was clear, or that every message could be placed in their hands. But it raised a much darker question. How much did the people inside that house really know? Then came the part police had been waiting for. Richard was pressed about Lucy and Iris, and according to officials, he admitted they were dead, and then led investigators back to the Bolivian house and showed them where to dig. Inside one of the rooms, beneath piles of earth and rubbish, police began excavating. And there, buried on the property, they found the bodies of Lucy Mayer and Iris Malin. Finally, the truth was being pulled from the ground. Reports later said Lucy had suffered a severe traumatic brain injury and had been literally beaten to death. Once dead, she was buried in a room near the back of the house, measuring just 3 by 4 meters. There are no definitive reports on what happened to Iris, but you can imagine she met a similar fate. But the Bolivian house did not just reveal 2 bodies. As investigators searched further, they found women's clothing, school uniforms, personal items, and objects that made the place feel even worse. They also recovered phones, and once investigators began to go through them, the scale of what Richard had been doing started to look far bigger than just Lucy and Iris. Reports later said Richard had targeted more than 77 women. Many had been contacted through fake job offers and then sent to hotels or rooms he had chosen himself. Those rooms were carefully picked. They had no windows and a lock which could only be opened with a key. The women would be kept isolated, extorted, and in many cases forced upon. And even that number, 77, may only be the part investigators could trace through phones and messages, and the women they were able to identify. Some victims were too frightened to come forward. Others may never have been found at all. So as police stood inside that house, looking at the belongings left behind, the question became how many other women had crossed Richard's path and never felt safe enough to speak. News of the discovery spread quickly, and crowds began gathering outside. Some of the neighbours were furious, others were families of missing people, standing there in the hopes of finding their relatives. They were terrified that Richard's house might hold the answers for them, and that was when the case came back to Fidel. Richard's aunt now had something she never had before, proof that he had been hiding bodies at properties connected to him. So she went back to the police and told them again about the San Martin house, the place tied to Fidel's disappearance all those years earlier. When investigators searched there, they found another body. It was Fidel's. Investigators later said Fidel had been poisoned, but Richard did not stop once his cousin was dead. He then tried to destroy the evidence, burning the body before decapitating him and placing the remains inside 2 black sacks. Those sacks were then buried in the patio of the family property, hidden in the same place where Fidel's mother had once believed her son's future was being arranged. And when police searched the area, they found something else that made the discovery even worse. Another hole had been dug, waiting for whoever Richard planned to bury next. The anger in Bolivia was immediate, because this was not a man nobody had seen coming. Richard had already been exposed. He'd already been convicted. A court had already decided he was too dangerous to be free. And still, he ended up back in El Alto, living with his mother, finding new victims, and burying the bodies at properties linked to him. Richard was sent back to prison, and the courts began dealing with the crimes that should never have been possible in the first place. He was given further maximum sentences, but even that did not feel like enough for many people. Under Bolivian law, the maximum sentence term is 30 years. So no matter how many lives were linked to him, the punishment could never match the scale of what he had done. But the case did not end with Richard. His mother and sister, the same 2 women accused of protecting him and running the fake social media, were also arrested and placed under investigation. They denied knowing what Richard had been doing, but for many people, that felt almost impossible to accept. They had lived around him, they had defended him, and for Fidel's family, they were not just relatives who stayed silent. They were the people who helped push a grieving mother away from the truth. Then investigators turned to the people who had helped Richard get out of prison. The medical certificate, which had been signed by Freddie Torrejon, the doctor linked to the document that helped Richard claim he needed house arrest for health reasons. And then there was the judge, Rafael Alcon. He was the man who approved Richard's release on Christmas Eve, 2019. Both of these people allowed a convicted killer to leave prison and return to the city where he would go on to offend again. Once the corruption around the release came to light, Alcon was arrested too, along with others accused of being part of the network that had made it possible. By the end, this case was not just about Richard, it was about the people who protected him, the officials who helped him, and a system that had already been given every warning it needed. Richard Shoku was not a killer who slipped through the cracks. He was a killer the system had already caught and then let back out. Terrifying. Thank you for watching. If you found this case as unsettling as I did, then please leave it a like and subscribe if you are new. Until next time, stay sane.